Hi, and welcome to RBP on JSB. I'm violinist Rachel Barton Pine, and today we're going to be talking about the first movement of Bach's Sonata No. 2 in A minor, the Grave. By the way, if you want to hear about some of the general issues that pertain to all of the sonatas and partitas, be sure to check out the overview episode. So the Grave of Bach's second sonata is very similar to the Adagio of Bach's first sonata in terms of being lots of written out ornaments, notes that are decorative rather than melodic, that are decorating a larger scheme that's happening underneath. But unlike the G minor Adagio, which has a very very simple structure of an 8-bar A section, a 5-bar middle section, B section, and then an exact repeat in a different key of the same 8-bar A section. ABA, that's what you get for the Bach Adagio. Now the Grave is a whole different story. It's much more complex in terms of what's going on with its underlying melody. So first of all, I want to point out that there are two spots that do repeat themselves, but never an exact recapitulation or anything along those lines. The first 7 quarter notes, the bass notes, are these. Those come back at the very end, starting in the middle of measure 23. And they also appear in the middle. Let's see if I can find it. Yes, measure 14, but in a different key. And indeed, the start of measure 14 does feel like some kind of a return, but then it goes off in a different direction, so it's not like the G minor Adagio that just repeats itself. There's another sequence that does happen twice, starting in measure 9. If you think of the beat as 1, 2, 3, 4. And then the same thing starting in the middle of 20. So just like in the G minor Adagio, of course what's happening on top of those patterns is utterly different every time, and so it's easy for those patterns to be obscured unless you specifically look for them. So I spent years trying to figure out what are the bass notes that are under all of this stuff. And now that doesn't necessarily mean what's the chord. There could be a bass note that's the 3rd of the chord or the 5th of the chord or something like that. And we'll talk about a few of those as we go along. But what are obviously the bass notes? We can kind of tell, for example, in the first section, we have an A, then a G, F. So it's really dom, bom, 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 going down. But of course, we don't have a C string. So F, E, D sharp, and then this is really an E, even though we don't get to an E in the violin part until the end of that beat. Sometimes we hear what the note is slightly ahead of when it's actually played, like we hear an A on the downbeat of bar 3 a 30-second before it appears in the decorations. We hear an F natural about a 16th early on the start of the second beat of measure 6, etc. So just trying to figure out, I hear a G in the downbeat of 16. That doesn't happen until the 3rd note in the ornament. So I spent years, as I said, trying to figure out what might the bass notes be. And then I got Onur Bilsma's new book on the Bach sonatas and partitas, and he actually had a whole written out bass line for this movement, and his was almost exactly the same as mine. So if two of us agree, maybe it's the right solution, or at least it's a viable solution. At least I don't have to feel like it's just my idea. I have Onur Bilsma backing me up, or me backing him up, or however you want to look at it. So I'm going to kind of walk you through the sections and the bass notes so that you know what this movement is really doing, because all the little 30 seconds and stuff, that's not really the music. Okay, so the first section goes from measure 1 all the way to the downbeat of measure 7. I already played you the opening. I'm going to go faster than one would really do it. Otherwise, it would take us too long. So here's your quarter notes. And then some major key. C major, and by the way, all that major key stuff swirling around, the F major that we get to at the downbeat of measure 4 is really a resting point, or it's kind of acting as a tonic. And then we have a B, which is actually part of the G7 chord, and then, you know, C chord, G, G7, and then a C major, which is our 1 chord, D7, F, and then this is really a C major, F, G, and then back to C. So it's important to figure out 3 things. What is the bass note? And then separately, what is the chord? Because the bass note might or might not be the root of the chord. And thirdly, is that chord a tonic within this section or not? Is it a leading chord or an arrival chord? You don't even have to use those fancy words. Leading chord, is it going to something or is it arriving at something? Now, we're not analyzing this like you're in your theory class. Nobody's going to be grading you. You don't have to do the right kinds of, you know, symbols for things or whatever. You know, only do it so that you know how the music goes. It's practical theory so that you can interpret the music better. Because if you know that this is a major chord, you're going to interpret it with a certain color. If you know that this is a leading chord, you're going to give it a certain emphasis, a certain type of phrasing, going to an arrival chord where you might take a little bit of time, that kind of thing. And that's why we need this information. Next section starts at measure 7 and goes till measure 12. So 1, 2. There's this section we already talked about. And by the way, this chord at the downbeat of 11 is a very surprising chord. It's not the direction we think it's going to go and resolve to E minor, but it has an extra bar built in there. E minor doesn't happen until measure 12. Instead it goes. We don't expect to hear that thing, the diminished chord there. And then to E minor. Then we have a short interlude section from measure 12 to measure 14. Half notes. So this C, by the way, is the bass note, but the chord is A minor. And then we have an A7 here, leading to the D minor, which is our new tonic for the time being. So this is kind of our return to the original 7-note motif, 7 bass note motif, right there at measure 14. And that section goes all the way till the middle of 17. Right there. And then we have that all the way to the end, which is measure 23. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. Here's our sequence. There's our surprise chord. We expect it to go to A, but instead it goes to that diminished chord, and then to A. So actually, it does have a certain amount of symmetry, right? We start with our da-da-da-da-da-da, and then we end, well, we don't exactly. Towards the end of the first section, we have that. But then we have this 2-bar interlude, and then we're back to the, and then we mess around some more, and then we have this thing with a surprise chord at the end of our main second section. And, big second section. Of course, I've given you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sections so far, but you can kind of think of sections 1 and 2 as connected in a certain way. In other words, measure 1 all the way to 12 as a big first section, 12 and 13 as a little kind of connector section, 14 to the middle of 23 is the next 2 sections with a D minor cadence in the middle is the next big section. Make sense? I hope so. Otherwise, rewind your video and listen again. I think I was clear. Now, measure 23 is really the end. The rest is a coda, or a connector section leading to the fugue, because unlike the G minor adagio, which ends, the movement finishes, it can stand alone, and you don't have to go on if you wanted to play it all by itself. This movement ends with an unresolved chord and leads you directly into the next movement, as does the first movement of the C major adagio, C major sonata, by the way. So now we have our connector, and interestingly, our connector is the exact same, our old friend, one last time, but this time leading to back E major, leading back to A minor to start our second movement. So what should you do once you've figured out these bass notes, chords, and what each chord means, whether it's a leading chord or a resting chord? Of course, use that to guide your interpretation. Which spots are stronger, which spots are flowing away from something or lingering after something, etc. And to really get it in your head, of course, play the bass line all by itself lots and lots and lots of times. But the movement does go so slow. Now let's think about it here. So your quarter note pace is almost like the start of the Bieber Passacaglia. It's almost any slower than that and it would be an 8, and of course the movement is not in 8, and please make sure it doesn't sound like it's being counted in 8. It should really be a strong feeling of 4. But that is pretty slow to keep the thread of all those notes. So what you want to do is sing the bass notes while you play the harmony, or the decorations. A, G, F, E, D, D sharp, E. Oh, that's a little challenging. Or you could play these and sing all the ornaments. It's going to sound pretty silly, but it's a good exercise for your brain. If you really can't stand your own singing, if you sound as bad as I do, then you can actually use modern technology and record yourself playing one or the other and then play the other over it. So that's another option. But somehow when you're singing and playing at the same time, it does make your brain work even differently than just playing over a recording. So if you can stand it, I do recommend it as a good practice exercise. There are certainly many instances throughout all of the sonatas and partitas where the bowings that Bach has are not entirely clear, where the slurs, it's like, well, the tip of the slur is pointing towards the note on the right, but it's curving over towards the left, but it's kind of in between 2 note heads, so which note head does it really start on, the one to the left or the one to the right? And there are certainly answers to those questions that most violinists have chosen over many, many generations, but that doesn't mean that they're the right answer or the right answer for you. Look at Bach's manuscript, make your own decisions, and I find that this particular movement, the grave in A minor, is particularly rife with difficult to understand slurs where it's unclear which note it begins on, which note it ends on, or if you're sure you know what it is, it just doesn't even work. So there's a lot to be figured out, and sometimes there's no one good solution, and you've just got to keep experimenting. There are measures that I've spent an hour messing around with a single measure, trying to figure out what I'm going to do. And then it ultimately comes down to what feels good, what sounds good, what do you like, and you know you're going to be compromising one way or another, and so it's just got to be something that works for you, that you can live with temporarily till you come up with a different answer. So The opening has a very difficult bowing pattern. We want to get to a down bow by beat 3, which means working backwards, we're going to be on an up bow and the slur leading to beat 3, which means one would think that we would be on a down bow on the note before, which is nice because it's a bass note, but that doesn't work because working backwards, that would mean we had to start up bow. And while there are plenty of movements that I think benefit from starting up bow, like the B flat major Sicilian, or the double of the B minor sarabande, or we even, gosh, could start up bow on the D minor sarabande for that matter, but no way. That doesn't work at all. We've got to play that first note down bow. So then we're stuck up bow. So, of course, many people go up, up, which is tricky. Or you could do a double down. Don't do that kind of thing. That's a romantic gesture. But a little lift. Not all the way to the frog. Or, yeah, not to the frog. That doesn't work. That's hard also. Yeah, I find that I can control the bow better doing the lift and the second down bow starting towards the upper half, but it might be different for you. Each of our bodies is different, so those are really the only two viable solutions, I think. What happens if you do everything backwards? Up and then down. No, that's no good. Yeah, so it's got to be down, down, up, or down, up, up. And neither is easy, and I would say practice both of them. Don't decide right away and then practice it. Practice both of them as if that's the way you're going to do it, and after a few days, see which one seems to be coming along, and make your decision based on what's physically comfortable. Because artistically, you could pull either of them off. It's just a question of literally what's physically comfortable. Okay, so then there's some bowings where he's inconsistent, like measure 2. We have, so, except it's not, it's, and then in measure 3, same notes but a step up with a long slur. So I think he must have meant to do them differently because it's more variety to do one thing a little differently than another thing. More interesting than doing both of them exactly the same. There are a couple of turns that you need to be aware of. The fact that trill is written over a note doesn't mean you have to make a trilly trill. In other words, every trill doesn't have to be lots and lots of, well, if it were vibrato, we would call it oscillations, but when it's trills, it doesn't have to be lots and lots of taps. As long as it's one tap, it's fulfilled its obligation to be something on that note. That's still, well, it's more of a turn, but, you know, it could still work, and these are over 30 seconds after all. And the rhythm is da, pony run, dum, right? So we want to make sure that da-da-dum doesn't get obscured by having too trilly of a trill, which morphs the rhythm and kind of distorts it. Because then your 30-second has become so long that it almost sounds like run, pony, instead of pony, run. So practice the one in measure 2 and the one in measure 3 without any trill whatsoever. And really get used to the way that that rhythm feels, and then add just as much trill as you can honestly put in there without distorting the rhythm. Which for me is only one little turn. But if you have a really fast trill, maybe you can squeeze in 2 of them, but that might sound too frenetic anyway. Oh, it's still turning into a dive. Now it's going da yum ba dum bum. Yeah, you want to keep it as 2 30 seconds and nothing else. So just a nice little turn. However, at measure 18, there's an honest to goodness trill, which is the one that you don't want the other 2 to sound like. So now we have a trill and a Nachschlag, a dotted 16th note trill followed by 2 64th notes. Gotta love all the 64th notes. So the question is, should we slur the Nachschlag in to the trill, as would normally be done in lots of music if you were doing it as a spontaneous Nachschlag? And another question, is that eighth note D a written out appoggiatura of the trill of the C? If all we had on that note was a quarter note C, we very well might give it an appoggiatura and a Nachschlag. If we saw with a trill, right, we would add an anticipation and then a turn at the end, and there we have our interpretation of a quarter note trill. He's given you a quarter note trill written out. So because he didn't put a slur, should we slur that in or not? Is it two separate notes? And what about the Nachschlag? Should we? So these days I actually do slur the anticipation as one gesture rather than two separate notes. Though you could argue that he didn't write a slur and maybe it was two separate notes, but I like it as, but then I do those separate. No good reason for it other than that. Maybe it's not what people would expect, so that kind of makes it fun for me, and it's certainly allowed. It's not that you had to make every single turn slurred. Anyway, I might change my mind next year, but that's what I like today. Another thing to think about are some of these two-voice things that have eighth notes in one voice and then a dotted eighth with a 16th in the other. I used to do them with separate bows, like in the middle of measure 10. So one voice is going your nice little eighth notes with space that the lower instrument is playing, and then, except it's that surprising chord, so the E is not so innocent. But recently I thought to myself, well, hang on. By not continuing the B, I'm losing that nice juicy, ninth over there. And I really miss having that ninth. So therefore, now I still make the bottom voice separate, but kind of like a hook. Kind of like the sort of things you do in, right, the C major andante from the, well, from this sonata. So, rather than dropping that note and then continuing. Of course, a lot of times we do drop notes, and we sort of imply their length, right? So there's so many examples of that. Measure 1 has 2 of them. We have an eighth note on the bottom voice, but 2 16th notes on the top voice. You could play it in third position and slur it to make this really be an eighth note, but that would be un-Baroque to go into the third position and kind of silly to add a slur. Would it solve our bowing problem? Yeah, but anyway, we shouldn't add that slur. I mean, nobody would argue about that. Next beat is even worse because we absolutely can't hold that eighth for an eighth because we have a repeat of the A, so we have to change bows. So each of those eighths is actually a 16th. Another eighth. That one is held for an eighth. And then this one is missing, should be an E, sort of our missing bass note. So, therefore, notes of their printed length is just how long we're supposed to think of them. And make sure that you don't accidentally hold them in places where they can be held but maybe shouldn't. For example, the end of 13 is a random example of that. There's a slur in the upper voice. It's physically possible to go. But if the cellist were playing it, they probably wouldn't legato that eighth into the next measure. They would have a little bit of space. So even though you could, I would recommend not doing that. All right, giving those eighths a little more room to breathe. Even though they're written as eighths, it doesn't tell you whether they're tenuto eighths or eighths with space. So that's one thing to also keep in mind. So back to measure 10 with the slur, there's another place just like it in measure 20 that I like to do the same thing. Now here's a fun fact, another bowing that Bach made different times. So the first time in measure 10, a 3-note slur, and the second time, 2 2-note slurs. Right? So just giving you variety, and of course you have to remember which is which. And if you accidentally mess up and you do the first one as 2 2-note slurs and you're, oh, I did the wrong one. You know what? I would recommend that when you get to measure 20, do a 3-note slur, because then you are making 2 mistakes, but at least you're still retaining Bach's variety. Better to do that than to do 2 2-note slurs twice. And then we have another bowing problem. End of measure 20. A little slur followed by another slur. And that just doesn't work because then you're backwards. So you either have to hook this one in before doing that one, or add this one in, which is what I currently do. But yeah, that's another one of those places where you can just bow yourself into circles and just, this doesn't work, but what can I do instead with the least amount of messing up Bach's possible intentions? And then another place where I like to have the hooked 8th notes with a 7. Okay, and that brings us to the coda. So we have a long slur, the longest in the movement, a full 2-beat half-bar slur. And a lot of people split this slur. If you do split it, it's really a good idea to make sure that you don't make it sound like 2 slurs. Make sure it still pretends to be one long slur. So a seamless bow change. Otherwise, actually, I feel like sometimes Bach's long slurs are telling us something. They're telling us that maybe we should have a really, really soft, because the only way to get that many notes in is to play softer. So maybe he's almost giving you a dynamic by giving you a long slur. Because we have our big ending, measure 21, then the coda. But wait, you might say, now I'm backwards. But this unresolved note seems a little unusual that it ended up bow, but it's not an ending. It's not a final note. It's a leading note. So that's what I've been doing lately, is ending up bow, which gives me a certain feeling that I really like transitioning between the 2 movements. But that might be uncomfortable for you, and I totally get that, in which case, obviously, split it and then and down bow. But don't end it like the movement ended. End it like there's a question mark in the air, which is still in the air, still in the air, and now we go on. Okay, so those last 2 quarters, squiggly lines, that actually means vibrato, or the shake, as it was sometimes called. There's a very fun treatise on violin playing, which luckily for English speakers is in English. It's called The Art of Playing on the Violin. Not playing the violin, playing on the violin. The Art of Playing on the Violin by Francesco Gemignani, from the first part of the 18th century, 17-something or another. I should have looked it up before I started filming this video. Anyhow, it talks about that exact same squiggly line that you see in Bach, and it is essentially a vibrato. So here we're using vibrato as an ornament. And then here we have a trill only on the upper note. But if you look at the prelude of Bach's 3rd cello suite, where he has 16th notes followed by a trill, where he only gives you 1 trill, but leading up to it, he has these 16ths. So why wouldn't you continue both voices? Right? So it's very likely that this might have been meant, and actually it's easier than Bach's. You don't have any parallel fingers on top of each other. So as long as you finger this 6th, 1, 3, you can put 2, 4 on top of them. if you're having trouble with the coordination, just do a Vamos double stop. If you don't have the Vamos double stop book, you should. But anyhow, how to get to that fingering. So in order to do our 1-3 comfortably, we've got to end up on a 1-2 over here. So the way to do that is, after you're in third position here, go down to second, and then, but don't use a 3. Use an open, hold your 1 down, another open, put your 2 down, and there you are. Magic. You're on your 1-2, then you're on your 1-3, so you slide your first finger up a half step, land your 3 next to where your 2 just was. Easy peasy. And then your 4 is ready, you just scoot your 1 down a whole step. And you have an octave which will hopefully be in tune. And there you have it. So one last little thing is the rhythm in measure 5. There's actually 2 spots which are mathematically incorrect in Bach's manuscript. The first is beat 3, where he has dotted 16ths followed by 3 64ths. Well, that doesn't add up because you have 1 64th too many in that 8th note worth of music, and then the exact same thing in the second 8th note of that quarter note beat. So does that mean that it should actually be not quite a dotted 16th, like more like a 16th tied to a 64th followed by 3 64ths, or should it be a real dotted 16th and the 64ths actually are a triplet? Well, or some other suggestion entirely, who knows? Make your own decision, but just be aware that if you see an Urtext edition where they've corrected it one way or another, either added a little 3 to make it into a triplet, or changed the dotted 16th into a 16th tied to a 64th, that's a little bit editorially irresponsible, because they should just tell you the rhythm that Bach put on the page, even if it's mathematically incorrect, so that you can make your own decision about how to interpret it. And then here we have a real dilemma, because we have in beat 4, 2 64ths, followed by a dotted 32nd, followed by another 64th, followed by the second half of the beat, which makes sense, 3 32nds and then 2 64ths. So what do we do with 2 64ths, a dotted 32nd, and a 64th? That's 1 32nd shy of an 8th note. So we could either do what most editions do, 2 64ths and a dotted 16th, and then a 32nd, or, wait, is that, yeah, 2 64ths, a dotted 16th, and a 32nd. Or we could an extra long and make a 64th followed by 32nds, or we could change the 64ths into 32nds. Now, there's one of those 3 options that I've discussed. That's the way you most often hear it. In fact, I don't know that you ever hear the other options, but the other options are equally as viable when you think about it, because something's got to be changed, and we all do it the way we all do it because we all do it that way, and that's never a good reason. So think about the options. There are probably more than even those 3, and decide what to do with that confusing measure, since we can't ask Bach. Well, those are some of my thoughts about the A minor grave. I'm violinist Rachel Barton Pine, and thank you for watching RBP on JSB.